Hi there, it's Robert, the Red Tie Guy, and for this week's Terms, Tech, and Tips Tuesday, I'm going over rent to own. Last week we covered seller carry, and that's somewhat similar or gets confused sometimes. So this week we are covering rent to own, and I will be going over what is rent to own and how is it different than seller carry. Why do I generally recommend that it is avoided? And last but not least, is there any circumstance where rent to own might actually be a good idea that doesn't result in buyer's remorse? But first, a disclaimer. This is general real estate advice and is not legal advice. This is advice to help you become more familiar with the terms of real estate transactions, but should not be used as advice specific to any transaction you are doing. If you are watching this for advice on a specific transaction you are in, consult with a real estate professional who represents your interest or with a lawyer. So, with that being said, what is rent to own and how is it different than seller carry? Last week, when we went over seller carry, we mentioned that the deed transfers immediately, and then the buyer is fulfilling their obligations to pay off a note or a debt to the seller. And over time, the seller gets the money, and the buyer is paying to avoid a foreclosure. In a rent to own, however, the deed does not transfer, not at the start. It might transfer halfway through the agreement and turn the rent to own into a note, or it might transfer at the end of the agreement. However, it doesn't transfer at the beginning. And so with a seller carry, you would have the right to refinance or potentially sell off the home and pay off the debt at the transaction of the refinance or the sale. In a rent to own, however, the buyer or tenant does not have the right to sell the home because they are not the owner. They don't have the deed. In fact, one could potentially argue in the whichever terms there are for the rent to own that the seller could potentially sell the property again with the rent to own agreement transferring. With that being said, I want you to think for a moment. There's two particular factors here. The first is, why would a seller not just choose to do a traditional sale and receive all of the money from the buyer or from the lender immediately upon the close of the deal? And why would a seller want to do a rent to own agreement instead of qualifying for rather than qualifying for a loan and having the refinance and sale options available to them? The answer to this is that it inherently creates a conflict. The seller would naturally be better off selling immediately for the full amount, and by doing a rent to own, it gives them reasons to potentially offer less than generous terms. In short, charge extra, more than a regular rental or mortgage would be in terms of monthly payment. Also, if the buyer backs out, if they cancel or stop living there, then the seller still has the full equity of the home. They're not transferring any part of the equity, and therefore the seller would be able to go back to square one. Get another tenant buyer on their rent to own and charge those extra fees. And yeah, the buyer tenant would walk away with nothing. In addition, the buyer tenant would typically be better qualifying for a loan or looking for qualifying for a loan, rather than get into a rent to own where the seller is aware that they do not qualify. And also, in addition, the buyer tenant should consider whether or not their life situation is going to change. If they're not building up equity and can't sell it in the middle of the term, a 15 or 30-year term, well, just think about it. How much has your life changed in the past 10 years or 15 years? Would you really want to enter into an agreement for 10 to 15 years just hoping that your life doesn't change and that you don't have to leave in the middle of the agreement, thus losing whatever you were paying extra for compared to a rental or compared to saving up for a purchase where you could be building up your own equity rather than in a rent-to-own agreement where you don't have the equity, where you don't have any equity until the end where the deed transfers. Now, with that being said, is there ever a circumstance where rent-to-own might be a good idea and isn't filled with buyer's remorse on once, or potentially a seller remorse for not selling the home outright? The only occasion I can think of would be a rent-to-own agreement between family, where perhaps you're trying to come into agreeable, long-term agreement to transfer the ownership of a home between family members. You want to keep the home within your extended family, but without the complications of involving a lender, or without the complications of a seller carry. And yet at the same time, you care more about keeping it in the family than making a lot of money. That would be the only circumstance I can think of where the seller isn't incentivized to put in harsh or difficult terms onto the buyer. And the only time when I think a buyer would actually be willing to do a long-term rental under these conditions, rather than avoiding the circumstance and trying to qualify for a loan rather than entering into this agreement. Regardless, as a whole, these are rare circumstances. If you are thinking of entering into a rent-to-own as a buyer, I want you to ask yourself, have you heard of anyone who entered into a rent-to-own agreement? And did they actually complete it? Yes, a reason why there's so very, very almost non-existent few that actually end up owning the home at the end of a rent-to-own agreement. And honestly, if you are considering this, I would strongly recommend that you look into whether it would be better off to work on your credit for a year and continue renting in a lease agreement. Or if you are the seller, would it be better off to just sell the home and be done with it? So, with that being said, that is this week's Terms, Tech, and Tips Tuesday. And I look forward to hearing from y'all. Let me know in the comments below if there's other terms or technology you'd like me to cover one week. If you have any questions or feedback, love to hear your thoughts. And be sure to subscribe to get more videos like this with terms, tech, seeing homes around Tucson, and general tips for buyers and sellers. I look forward to hearing from y'all. Thank you.